Hello there, listening audience. This is Michael Cross here with another episode of Unlock the Door Radio, where we follow Benjamin Franklin's advice, and that is to question authority in order to maintain the liberties we have today, or at least we used to have. Anyway, this afternoon we have a very special guest. He is a medical doctor, holds his degree from the University of Texas. I believe he's an anesthesiologist. And he's also an author of books that deal with the invasions of our privacy by various government agencies. And he has a book called that came out a few years ago, and I will note before the Edward Snowden revelations. It's called A New Breed: Satellite Terrorism in America. Really cool cover, by the way. I really love the cover with the sunglasses and a satellite reflected in one, and then a young woman sitting on a beach in the other, kind of showing how we are basically exposed today in America. And he has another book coming out here on the same topic, but it's more updated. It's Dr. John Hall. Welcome, Dr. Hall, or do you want me to call you John?
Either one, Michael. It's glad to be with you. How are you doing today?
Oh, very good, very good. And I've been looking forward to this interview a lot. And your book, the one that came out in 2010, The New Breed, it deals with the invasions of privacy on a very high-tech level. But could we just start off a little bit? Because a lot of people, when they may be just tuning in for the first time, and they know about the NSA now, and they know about the fact that, you can track where you're at, wherever, whatever. They know what computer websites you go to, and they record your phone calls. They know that. But I think a lot of people, if they hear things like MK Ultra and COINTELPRO, they really are vague on those kinds of terms. Could you explain kind of a little bit in regards to how the U.S. government has employed mind control in the past, which seems to go against our democratic values?
Sure, Michael. Actually, what you're talking about with MK Ultra and its related projects, there were a number. MK Ultra was only one program. There was MK Search, Artichoke, Bluebird, Monarch. There were a bunch. And that's how we got here. I mean, those programs started in the late 50s, early 60s, predominantly CIA funded. Were funded through front companies, so there was plausible deniability. Most of the research was done, or a lot of it was headed up by psychiatrists. So no wonder that as the technology has advanced, that it's meant to mimic mental illness. It was meant to do that from the start. MK Ultra was 149 sub-projects. All of them were geared at controlling human beings remotely. And I mean the research, it was very impressive research that was done. It was complete. Not only did they research the physiology and the brain physiology, they researched individual adult behavior. They researched group behavior, child behavior. I mean, all of this headed up by neuropsychiatrist or psychiatrist. Each sub-project dealing with one part of the puzzle. What most people have heard of is like Delgado's brain chipping experiments, or Ewan Cameron's drug and bombarding, females that were told that they had severe postpartum depression and were locked away for months at a time, getting about 900 times normal shock therapy or electroconvulsive therapy to try to create Manchurian candidates. The whole point of that particular sub-project was to wipe the slate clean and create a new personality. And those are some of the more horrific stories that some people may see on online about MK Ultra. But it even went as far as, like I said, studying child behavior, studying group behavior, behavior on playgrounds, behavior in prisons. I mean, it was such a complete series of studies that they wanted to learn not only how to control the individual, but to how to control group behavior. And some of the allegations that have been made is that some of the early cults, suicidal cults like Jim Jones in Guyana, the Heaven's Gate cult that all killed themselves when the comet was coming. If you delve into that a little deeper, you'll see that there were CIA connections in all those cults. And allegations have been made that are pretty sound allegations that some of these cults were actually intentionally formed as group study. So they had a captive group to study, individual interaction on as far as control mechanisms. So the important thing for people to understand with that is that's how we got here. We had the Church Committee and we had the Rockefeller Commission in the 70s. Alan Dulles destroyed most of the records regarding MKUltra, but he missed most of the financial records. They were housed someplace else. So we did get the financial records, so we know where the money was going, what the money was for. Now, admittedly, some of those records are diversional because they would intentionally make false records regarding a lot of stuff, in knowing that eventually somebody would look. But if you wade through the BS and look at the financial records, we pretty much can tell which universities did the studies, how they were funded by front companies like the Human Ecology Fund that was created by the CIA. And most of these studies, like I said, were done by Ewan Cameron, Sidney Gottlieb, Jolyon West, Delgado, Robert Heath. These were all guys that were heads in their fields of psychiatry or neuropsychiatry. All testified in Congress, all pretty much would be considered monsters by Nuremberg trial standards, but all died with glowing eulogies about how they contributed to the knowledge of psychiatry. So, we're dealing with a government that has done similar things to the Nazis, experimentation done in Nazi Germany, but looks at it as okay because it's done in the interest of national security. And most of those heads of these projects during those congressional hearings cited national security issues as the reason it was okay to basically experiment non-consensually on most of these individuals.
Well, you bring up the Nazis. I just want to ask real quick. I've heard that during Operation Paperclip, the reason why some of these experiments seemed like things you'd hear about in a concentration camp was that they actually did bring over psychologists and psychiatrists from Germany after the war who'd worked on some pretty horrific things in order to find out their research.
Oh, let me tell you, here in San Antonio, where I practice, at Brooks Air Force Base, they brought over Hubertus Strughold. He had actually did high-altitude experimentations on the Jews, where you basically, put them up to high altitude in suits that may or may not work to keep you from exploding. Did a bunch of really dastardly experiments on Jewish prisoners. He was brought over through Operation Paperclip. And essentially became the father of American aerospace medicine here in San Antonio. And until recently, when there was enough public outcry to get the name changed, had a library named after him here in San Antonio at Brooks Air Force Base.
Yeah. Well, if people look it up, Wernher von Braun, a lot of them were really high up officials that helped put us into space. But I guess it's one thing to be building rockets, but a lot of this technology, a lot of these things, I guess, that really go back even before the 50s and go back to like Nazi Germany. It seems like a lot of this it wasn't really designed to prevent the Soviets from coming and taking us over, but it was designed to control the masses, to control I've read stuff about, how to go about controlling fertility habits in a given population, how to control the way people protest and how to prevent them from protesting. A lot of stuff that people might think, well, wait a minute, that's a person's very private or human right. They were doing experiments with using really top-notch psychologists to figure out how to get you to change.
Oh, well, that's exactly it. It's most of the industrialized world we have governments now that aren't satisfied with governing. They want to control, and certainly the technology that I wrote about and the technology in my upcoming book, which will hopefully be released this summer, is called Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control. And I go extensively into the history of non-consensual experimentation. It's not a story like my first book, A New Breed. It's more of a technological book. And I do go cover non-consensual experimentation right up until, the 90s and 2000s. And go into a little bit about how directed energy works, how extremely low frequency waves work, what their effects are on the body. It'll be somewhat of a difficult read. It's going to be a technological book, But I certainly cover all that because it's important to understand that, because at least in the United States, people have the belief that the government is restricted on experimentation the same way a drug company would be, that you have to demonstrate that you have an institutional review board and that there are safeguards against what you're doing to the people that are being experimented on. And believe it or not, that legislation does not exist in the United States. We have legislation called the Common Rule that's a loosely formed bunch of legislative rules that allegedly govern experimentation, but there are loopholes in it that actually allow for intelligence agencies to run their experimentation without an IRB or an institutional review board. Most of that is black ops, so it's covered by a black budget. So even the people giving the money, when Congress funds it, really doesn't know what it's being used for. John Glenn, some years ago, tried to pass legislation stating that any experimentation funded by the government had to be done with informed consent, and it was shot down in Congress. So I actually testified at the Bioethics Commission several years ago that the Obama State Department held after it came to light that we had experimented on Guatemalans with syphilis and gonorrhea against their will, without consent. And the Bioethics Commission was formed, and their job was to determine if any non-consensual experimentation was ongoing in the United States or abroad. The board was pretty much filled with apologists who pointed out the Common Rule was in place, that most of the horrific experiments you hear about were post-World War II, prior to legislation. I was the only person that stood up and pointed out the flaws in the Common Rule, which one of them clearly states that if it's in the best interest of the experimentation to notify the subjects after the fact. Well, typically that's what our government does. Tuskegee, the radiation experiments, we experimented on a bunch of black men with syphilis as part of the Tuskegee experimentation. When it finally made the press, 60 years later, then they admitted that it happened, and the surviving family members were offered an apology. Radiation experiments in New Mexico and Arizona, these people were dying of various cancers, being told that they were mentally ill and there was nothing wrong with them. Well, then Clinton comes into office, and we have the Acre hearings in the 90s when they called for all the documentation from the various agencies that took part in the experimentation. And then, of course, the surviving victims were given an apology. And that'll be the same thing. I mean, we're hoping not to get the same thing, but it probably will be the same thing with directed energy experimentation. Well, these people that you hear about hearing voices and being attacked by directed energy and being controlled by radio frequency is being done. It is a continuation of MK Ultra, and eventually there'll be some media light on it. And 40 years from now, there'll be a lame apology offered by whoever's in the State Department at that time.
Well, the thing is, though, the 70s were that time period of kind of a social revolution. And you had people like Church who, pretty much drugged the CIA over the coals to try to find out what was going on. The 90s, we still had a certain level of that left, although it seemed that materialism was kind of taking over that generation that had, been out there trying to stop things. And now, though, we're in that post 9/11 era where, it just seems like now you're not even supposed to question the government. I know that, if you look at TV programs from the 90s, a lot of them had like X-Files had kind of like conspiracy overtones where the government was the bad guy. And then after 9/11, it all changed. Now government's wonderful, and we're supposed to be out there, waving the flag and never questioning and that sort of thing. We have professionals, at the airports, and all this kind of stuff. It seems to me that in that atmosphere, you'd be getting a lot more weird stuff. Even in the 50s, you had it seems to me that you had a lot more, ethics in the general scientific community, maybe in the 50s than maybe today, where, you have psychologists that come up with torture manuals to use at Gitmo. And, they feel totally justified in doing so?
Well, you're exactly right on that. And believe it or not, I actually bring that up in the book that's coming out this summer, that part of what we need to do to fix this. I know I have a lot of victims that email me and they say, well, what are some shielding tips? How do I shield myself? Well, protecting the individual is one thing, and there are some tips for that. But in order to get change, I mean, this technology is not going to go away. And believe it or not, there are some good uses for this technology. It's just not being used that way. I mean, it doesn't have to be horrific technology. It can be used for good. It's just not being used for good. But you're right. What we need is societal change. We've allowed ourselves to be duped by the government into thinking that they know what's best for us. The government no longer fears the people. It's just the opposite. The people now fear the government. And at least in the United States, we're down to a point where we've got, I think 50% of the population on one form of welfare or another. We've got 30 or 40% on one form of disability or another. Once you have a population that's deriving most of its income off of the government, well, they're going to vote however that government wants them to vote in order to continue their entitlements. And, that is one problem that's come along. When Obama got in, a lot of people held a lot of high hopes for him. He was talking about transparency. Certainly, we had a lot of problems with the Bush administration with the Patriot Act. And what I write in the book is, Bush may have sat the ball on the tee with the Patriot Act. Obama kicked it through the uprights. He has prosecuted more whistleblowers than all three presidents in the past combined. He's been the least transparent about, this type of technology. He appointed a bioethics commission that was filled with apologists who, at the end of the day, said that there was no evidence of non-consensual experimentation going on, despite having thousands of victims at each one of those meetings voicing their complaints. The Benghazi cover-up, everything else is just, everybody had high hopes that there would be some legitimate change with him. And it's almost like the Democratic Party has been somewhat hijacked by globalists. And ultimately, people always ask me, well, what's the end game with control technology? Well, the end game is controlling the world population. And even some of the people like Persinger, who first started working with ELF wave control and microwave energy and its effects on the human anatomy, he said 10 years ago that eventually every brain on the planet could be controlled with, ELF. The brain's very susceptible to ELF. It can make you see things, can make you hear things, can implant memories, false memories. Putin came forward about a year ago in a conference and said that whichever country actually had the best psychotronic weaponry, and psychotronic weaponry is radio frequency or electromagnetic based weapons that bind with the attack the human nervous system, said that whichever country had the best psychotronic weapons would control the planet without bullets or missiles. And not one media source in this country picked up on that comment. The only media source that contacted me for a rebuttal was El Spectador out of Colombia. He has admitted that they've had the technology. The technology actually started there. We took over the reins on perfecting it. But the initial voice-to-skull technology was started by Igor Smirnov. When he died, his wife basically sold the technology to the highest bidder, which were a couple of private intelligence contractors here in the United States.
Well, I would note that, first of all, if 2 years ago you would have said that everyone's every move on the internet is monitored, cell phones, it's kind of ironic, they know where everyone can be using their iPhones, but you can't find an airplane, in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean or something, in which probably everyone on the freaking plane had an iPhone or a cell phone and so forth. But for some reason, with all the satellites, there was just nothing. I mean, that seems just a little weird to me. I mean, it just seems weird. But
well, and that's where Snowden stuff comes to value, because most of the what we call targeted individuals are the people that are the guinea pigs of directed energy technology. They've said for the last 15 years, my text messages are being watched and being altered, my emails are being watched and heck, I've sat at my computer and watched somebody move my cursor around remotely and erase my emails. So, it's been done for some time, and these people have complained about this for 15 years. And, of course, they were called the tinfoil hat people, and you're crazy, and that, that can't be done. Same way with the weapons that actually interact with the human nervous system. For years, people thought that the human brain was too technical and too complex to do anything with. Well, it turns out it's just the opposite. Human brain's not that complex. It transmits. Malik discovered that in the 70s, that if you shoot two dissimilar frequencies into the human brain, it entrains those frequencies and it spits out an interference frequency, and the EEG can be derived and decoded from that interference frequency remotely. It was invented as a way to monitor pilots for when they were falling asleep or hallucinating, and then you could zap them or buzz them with something to bring them back to reality. So as it turns out, the human brain's not that complex. And then Snowden came out with his documents that, indeed all of this stuff is happening. So the conspiracy theorists no longer were theorists. They were conspiracy facts.
Mm-hmm. I just have to ask you this. If you talk about vibrational frequencies, well, your appliances, the electrical wires around telephone or electrical poles, stuff like that, street lights, those have a vibrational frequency. Now I've heard that you can actually detect people's conversations remotely, not even using advanced equipment. You could use, if they're standing underneath a street light and talking, you could pick that up. Is that true?
Yep. Yeah. Anything that will resonate, you can actually put a laser on it and pick up the spoken word. And what you may not know is that, at least with our home wiring, the little plug in your wall that has the two spades and then the one little circular hole, people refer to the circular hole as a ground. Well, it's not truly a ground, it's a return. I mean, some of the dissipated energy in your home wiring does go through the foundation into the ground. Most of it returns to the pole. And I've had lengthy conversations with higher ups in the energy department about this. And actually the way they catch a lot of drug dealers and crack houses, they supposedly have to have a warrant to do it. But law enforcement or FBI can actually put a listening device on the return wire, which is the wire, the lower wire on electrical poles where the energy returns, and actually can pick up spoken word in the home using your house wiring. And as a matter of fact, the guys that work on the poles, that are up on the lifts and doing transformer work, they communicate to each other down the line through that line. They hook up to it and talk to each other. They don't use walkie-talkies. They use the line. So, I mean, we've known that for a long time, that home wiring can indeed be used as a receiver.
So you don't talk about anything private under a street light.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you heard about this, but a couple of years ago I ran across an article that was speculating that you could use this kind of technology you're talking about in a region. Let's say you're in, Kandahar or Waziristan or something like that. And your target are a group of, Taliban. And, for no better, term for it. And that you could use frequency to target the parts of the brain that were associated with, religious zeal and tone them down in some way so that these people who are really hardcore religiously, you could use the word fanatic, I don't know, you could actually almost tranquilize that part of the brain. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, and that's been possible for a long time. We know what frequencies will actually cause aggression, what frequencies will cause depression or somnolence. And more than that, we know what frequencies can be modulated to carry sound into the head. And actually in the first Iraqi war, that system was used. I don't know if you remember, there was one incident where it was about 2,500 Iraqi soldiers surrendered to like 100 Marines. Actually got down on their knees and disassembled their weapons. The Marines didn't have enough slip ties to tie these guys together. It was that overwhelming of a surrender. Well, what had been deployed on those men was SQUAD, or Silent Sound Spread Spectrum, and that was an invention by Dr. Robert Lowry. And SQUAD actually puts voices in your head, and what they had deployed was Allah speaking to these men, telling them to surrender. That's what they each heard in their head. Now, that was used on a group, but that technology can be used on an individual as well, and it's all done remotely and with no chipping or anything like that. So, there's several ways to put voices in one's head. SQUAD will do it. Ultrasonic sound will do it. People that don't believe that, if you want to get your hands on your own little apparatus to do it, there's a device called an audio spotlight, and it uses ultrasonic sound and a square antenna. And you can actually point that antenna at one individual sitting at a table of other individuals at a library, and only the individual you're targeting will hear what you're broadcasting to them in their head.
Yeah, I saw that demonstrated in a documentary that it was like in a huge, giant, like, Royal Academy type library, and I think it was in England. And they did that, and it just totally freaked people out that were sitting at tables. And I mean, it seems to me that if you're doing that to people, they may start thinking they're schizophrenic if they're hearing these voices.
You'd be surprised how many victims that have contacted me that began hearing voices and, people persecuting them, usually persecutory things being said while they're being attacked with directed energy. Well, and, so they actually checked themselves into the doctor. They said, well, I'm hearing voices, so I guess I'm crazy. Well, true schizophrenics don't think they're crazy when they hear voices, and they don't seek help for it. Most of them usually think they have been ordained by God, and schizophrenics tend to hear muffled voices, like a bunch of voices in a subway, and not necessarily clear, distinct orders. What the victims I work with describe as someone's attacking them with directed energy, burning the skin, making the muscles twitch, while at the same time they're hearing a voice saying, we're making your arm twitch. We're not going to let you use the computer. We're going to burn a hole through your chest. So the spoken word coincides with the correct attack. And usually it's later on in life. Most of the victims, are between 30 and 50. Most of them are female. Most of them are above the age of schizophrenic diagnosis. Schizophrenia starts at a young age. I mean, in men, 16 to 20, women maybe 18 to 23. But even then, most of those people will say, those people even as a child weren't right. We knew there was something not right. You don't all of a sudden, have a degree, have a professional life, making a good living, and at age 40 start hearing voices and thinking you're being attacked. That's not schizophrenia.
So you're working with a lot of people who just contact you and say that just overnight they're getting what are some of the messages? Is it just like someone playing around, or is it like asking them to do things?
Yeah, well, a little of both. I mean, usually it takes a while to target someone with that. So, the targeting may have actually started months before, and they're testing out different frequencies while you're in groups usually until they notice that you're hearing them and no one else around you is. Well, once they know they've captured you, and that they can get you to hear things that people in the surroundings can't, well, then that's when usually they make sure to describe your whereabouts, what you're doing, where you're at. I mean, they make it clear to the victim that it's a surveillance issue. Usually they'll say, well, okay, well, you're going into the bathroom, or sometimes they'll even play third person where they won't actually interact directly with the victim, but they'll pretend like it's a true surveillance operation. He's walking into the bathroom. He's going down the hallway. He's getting in his car now. He's driving to the store. And the whole time you're hearing that and you're going, man, somebody's watching me. That's exactly what I'm doing. And oftentimes there is some organized stalking with it. There's some people that you don't know that are stalking you. And that's done for a reason. It's not only is it a PSYOPs program to put the person in a victim mind state, but we think more than that, it almost always starts with organized stalking. And this is 24/7 stalking. Somebody outside your driveway, somebody at work with you, at the store with you. I mean, it's inundated type stalking. And we think that that's actually done to GPS the individual by vicinity. And that negates the need for chipping that person. Because the people that have been chipped in the past, the chip is strictly for tracking. The rest of the constellation of symptoms is actually caused by directed energy attacks and radio frequency attacks. Well, if you can GPS that person by vicinity until you can get a read on their brain waves and do, Malik's, which is way advanced from what Malik actually invented, but the same principle of remote neural monitoring, altering the brain waves, modulating the brain waves, and using them as a weapon, then you negate the need to actually try to drug somebody and put a chip in them, because most of the people that we have found chips in, they verify some lost time where they've been drugged with Rohypnol. They usually have a puncture mark, and then you can usually find a Vera chip or that type of chip in them with X-ray. But most of the victims in the last several years, they may come up with positive RF scans where they are transmitting, but we're not finding any chips. And most of us think that all of this can be done without any type of an implant. And that would be the reason for the organized stalking, is just GPSing that individual by vicinity.
So thus, that's what you mean by terrorism by satellite. That,
yeah.
I mean, America controls like over half of all satellites that are in orbit of the Earth.
And just so you know, too, America also declined to sign the UN treaty disallowing the weaponization of space. Most of the European countries were willing to sign. The United States would not.
In fact, when the Soviet Union still existed, they signed it. I mean, they wanted not to weaponize space, and America offered the idea that they would sign, if I recall right, there would be no nuclear weapons put in space, and then they could say so it would give the impression to the population we've de-weaponized space, when in reality you can put anything you want in space as long as it's not a nuclear bomb.
Well, and when I wrote the book, I had a lot of people, say, well, we just don't think this can be done via satellite. Well, for one, the victims that we studied, we took them onto ranches where there's no power lines and no cell phone towers, and actually checked for radio frequencies, and there are none, and they still heard voices and they still got attacked. We did the same thing in the ocean. We've had victims that have flown all over the globe. While they're flying, they still hear voices and they still get attacked. Well, there's really only one technology that can do that, and that's satellite. I talked to some CIA people that I'm friends with that are still active CIA before writing the book, and asked them straight out. I said, look, do we have a weapon system on a satellite platform that can do this? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes, that we do. Now, they did also tell me that it's a weapon of war and it's only for use abroad. But that's not to say that, there's some people within, these multiple agencies. And I don't think it's just the CIA anymore. I think it's CIA, NSA, and DIA that are actually using it experimentally in long-term experimentation to see what the long-term effects of exposing to someone to this type of technology is, because most of these victims have been victims for a decade or longer. And coming from a medical point of view, the only reason to experiment on somebody for that long is to see if it's going to cause some form of weird cancer or some form of weird psychiatric disease before you release it on the general public as a whole.
Well, then, have you tested some of these people on like an MRI to see if there's something wrong? I'm playing devil's advocate here. Yeah. To see if there's something really wrong. Is there something messed up organically with their brain, or are their brains just normal?
No, they're normal. And I've got MRIs on just about every victim that's ever contacted me. You would be amazed at how many discs I get in the mail every day of victims just saying, I went and got an MRI. Will you please read it and look at it? Because they're saying it's normal. The radiologist is saying it's normal. And 99.9% of the time I look at it, it is normal. Now, we have found chips in a handful of people, but that's the rarity and not the rule. Most people are not chipped.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this sounds science fiction, but then again, when the church committee pointed out that they had a gun that could, shoot several hundred meters and it would shoot like a frozen poison into someone's neck, that would sound like something from a James Bond movie.
If you saw some of the attempts they were making on Castro, I mean, they pulled out the stops. I mean, they were talking about trying to inject him with cone snail toxin, using a lotion, putting something in his lotion that he could absorb through the skin. I mean, they were trying every way they could to get at Castro. And that's really when they came up with some very interesting, an umbrella that shoots a poison dart. It was pretty unbelievable. Well, what happened was with the advent of satellite-based directed energy, that changed the game. Because no longer do you have to corral a bunch of people into a mental institution to experiment on them, like what happened in MK Ultra. The society now is the lab.
Okay, so I would just say that I think a lot of people got a totally different impression of government when they watched a couple of years ago when the Occupy Wall Street. Those kids. Most of those people that were out there were they may dress funny or something, but they were actually coming from the middle class ultimately. And they were protesting, and the cops just beat the heck out of them. And it was a coordinated thing. This was not just something, some rogue cops going crazy. This was, from my understanding, they were getting instructed by the government to do this.
Yeah, they were. And if you look at some of the economic summits that they had in L.A. and in New York, the police actually brought out LRADs, long-range acoustic devices, to control the crowds. And that also can be directed at a group or an individual and bombard you with sound that's so disconcerting to the human body that it shuts you down. And at the right frequency can shut down the nervous system. And that's been put into use here in the United States. We also have millimeter wave weapons that are now being used. One of them is called Silent Guardian by Raytheon, and it's being experimented in a LA prison where it's just basically it's a millimeter wave weapon, situated on the ceiling of one of the population rooms where there's multiple prisoners in the room at the same time. And if somebody gets out of line, a guard with a joystick can aim this at the prisoner and zap him with millimeter wave, which burns, and will make him move out of the way of the beam and, where he can be collected up by guards and pulled out of the room. So, these weapons are in use already.
Wow. Do you feel I know you're running short on time here, but do you feel discouraged by this, or is there something that people can do to, in some way, kind of put the brakes on this technology? Technology is a wonderful thing. I think with every technology, whether it's nanotechnology, whether it's, transhumanist technology, it could be used for really good things, but in the wrong hands, it can be used for opposite.
Oh, well, you're right. Especially with voice-to-skull type technology. The reason voice-to-skull technology works so well is if I put a voice in your head that sounds like me, you're going to perceive that as harassment. If I put a voice inside your head that sounds like you, that becomes a thought, and you act on those thoughts. And that's what we've seen with some of these mass shooters, like Aaron Alexis, the man that shot up the Navy Yard. He had contacted me indirectly several times before that Navy Yard shooting, complaining of being victimized by ELF technology. The man had a clearance. He worked in the IT field. He knew damn well what the technology was and wanted to know how to avoid the sleep deprivation. The shooting he wasn't controlled to shoot up the Navy Yard. He shot up the Navy Yard out of vengeance. And that's why he put "This is my ELF weapon" on the side of his shotgun. I think they were trying to control him into being a controlled assassin or Manchurian candidate, if you will. And I think their intent was to have him shoot up the airport, where he had kind of gone berserk on some people that he thought were ridiculing him. But he realized later on that the people he walked by weren't the ones ridiculing him, that he was hearing voices that were being transmitted to him. So he figured out what the technology was. So that's the disconcerting thing, is that people are being controlled to do things that will further a government agenda. And until we have public exposure that's good enough that just about everybody will believe this technology exists, you're going to continue to see these controlled shooters, because they want gun control here. They thought when the Sandy Hook shooting took place that if a lot of children got shot up, that the public would cry out for gun control, and they didn't. So then we had Aaron Alexis. Well, interestingly enough, when he didn't shoot up the airport, if you notice, it was only 2 weeks later we did have a shooter claiming mind control that shot up the LA airport. So, that's all being planned out very succinctly. That's not random. These aren't just crazy people that all of a sudden went crazy and took a gun and shot up stuff. They are being controlled. And that's the disconcerting thing, because that same technology can be used, to help with drug addiction, to help with, child porn addiction. There are good things that can be done with it that just aren't being done.
Well, I guess the best analogy I'd think of is like when a kid gets abducted and they have a cell phone. Your national agencies, your NSA, could actually, within minutes, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, could tell you exactly where that kid is. But that information, of course, would not be shared with local police departments.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, like you said, technology has a place, good and bad. Unfortunately, with our government, usually they try to find ways to use it for war before it trickles down to being used for good. As far as exposure of this technology, that's going to take some governmental change and some societal change. Like I said, we need to focus more on getting people into government offices that have some morality and have some ethics. Term limits would certainly help with that. I don't think anybody should serve in Congress for 30 or 40 years. You should be able to go up there, maybe serve 4 terms, and then have to get back out in society and scratch the dirt like the rest of us to make a living. I don't think it's any mystery that you can become a congressman for $150,000 a year salary and become a millionaire. They get stock investment information that the rest of us don't get. Like one particular Pennsylvania congressman, when he found out they were going to put a turnpike through the middle of his state, he bought up the land where the turnpike was going to go, and started renting it out to people to put shops and restaurants and gas stations. Became a multimillionaire overnight by buying up a bunch of cheap land where he knew the turnpike was going to go. And the way to get around that is to, first off, have exposure to the public, and we are getting that. My first book's being turned into a movie. People interested in that, it's newbreedmovie.com. I can't say exactly because I'm under contract, but there is a very large TV network that's about to start a TV series on targeting, especially in lieu of what came out with Snowden. So we're getting there. We're finally getting some public exposure in the right places. In my book, for instance, I knew when that book came out that half the people were going to read it were going to think I was crazy. But if I got through to 1 or 2 people, that would be good enough. And I had a number of people email me saying, my wife or my son or my daughter was going through this, and we went to several different psychiatrists, and nobody could help them. And until we heard you on a radio show talking about this, now we know what's going on. And that's more of what we need. We need to educate community psychiatrists that indeed there are technologies that put voices in your head, that just because somebody comes in saying they're hearing voices isn't a turnkey diagnosis of delusional disorder or schizophrenia, that, if there's technology that can do it, you got to rule that out first. And get some people in office that are ethical enough to have another church committee or Rockefeller Commission.
Mm-hmm. And flood the social media with information. Well, I'd love to go on, but you said you have some patience and stuff. So I'd just like to thank you very much for coming on and sharing this information with the audience. And I hope people will check your books and your website. Where can people find that? Do you have one?
Yeah, I've got a couple websites. One is www.satweapons.com, satweapons.com. And my medical website is drjohnrhall.com.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your information. And I really encourage people to check out your website and, get the book. It sounds really fascinating, considering, technology is pretty awesome, but sometimes it can be used for the wrong things. So anyway, thank you again, Mr. Hall, Dr. Hall, I should say. I really liked our interview with Dr. Hall there. That was quite fascinating. I've done quite a bit of research, not as much as him, but at least academically, into a lot of the psychology, the programs that have been used to indoctrinate people. And that's really what mind control is all about. Mind control can be just simple propaganda, to where you only show one side, or you show only the glorious or the hideous sides of an issue. That's mind control. Mind control can just be giving one piece of information to people without the other piece. And, mind control, what bothers me is not so much individuals who come out and try to persuade you to vote for them or to approve their programs, to discontinue something or to start something. power of persuasion is a really good thing. That's what our democracy or republic is based upon. However, what bothers me is when it's more of a group effort, when you have things being done to mold people's minds a certain way. Now, on a previous show, I pointed out how, you could go on the internet and find these speeches by professors who are involved in programs in which they suggest to TV producers, and in some of the cases they actually make these programs, but they'll suggest to writers and producers to only show small families and to show women getting married much later than traditionally. So if you're in a country such as Brazil, and maybe 30 years ago the average woman was married by the time she was 20, what you do is you show all the soap operas in which the successful women are the ones who wait until they're like, 30 or 35 years of age or something like that, which I think you see a lot of that in American chick flicks, where women are portrayed as being single until they're in their 30s, still saying they're going to have their families and everything and kind of ignoring the biological clock. But, I'm just wondering, when I see these kinds of things put out by population control people to persuade people to have less kids, not by saying, we need to do it for these reasons, but just doing it subtly, under the radar. That's mind control, and I don't like that. Okay? If someone wants to, on their own, decide to, extinct their family, line and decide, I'm not going to have kids for these reasons. That's one thing, but the idea that we sort of promote in society that, you should wait, and then, if you do get married and your career is going okay, then you should consider having kids, but oh my gosh, don't have any more than 2. One's better. And that, I think, is not so much driven by, intellectual concerns one way or another, and I could argue both ways on population. I just think that the West, America, Europe, Japan, Korea, and quite a few other countries are going to be in some real problems if they don't get their birth rates up. So you can't just look at it as a one shoe fits all. There's countries where people have 10, 12, 15 kids, and they don't have the infrastructure to support that yet. And so you're going to have more poverty, which will reduce infrastructure development in those countries. So obviously, if you're dealing with some of those countries, maybe there should be some population control. But this whole idea of just subtly doing it, I don't like that. And then we look at the things going on with the whole demonization of Russia. I don't know how many of you saw this at the Eurovision Song Contest. You can look at it on the internet. Now, I could care less if some guy from Austria wearing a dress and with a beard won. Okay? I mean, so what? I mean, that's what people wanted to vote for. That's fine. And if that's that was just their choice. However, when the 2 young Russian twins who were representing Russia got up and were booed, and every time someone voted for the Russians to win, they, gave points to them. They were booed as well. You kind of wonder, why is that? Why is it that suddenly, a lot of this hatred towards Russia? Oh, come on. We know the answer to that. There's been a concerted effort in the American press. And, it's kind of weird that it happened right when the Edward Snowden thing broke out. Okay? That all of a sudden you had all of these articles demonizing Russia over a bill that, from my understanding, whether you like it or not, and whether you feel that it goes too far or not enough, whatever, the only thing it said was that you can't teach homosexuality to kids under 17. And I mean, obviously there's real concerns. What if you write a book in which one of the main characters, who's the good guy or something, happens to be gay or something? Well, I mean, can you get thrown in jail for that over there? If you're there, I mean, maybe. So, but regardless of the situation, you gotta say, there's a lot of countries in the Middle East where there's a death penalty for homosexuality. There's countries, India recently recriminalized homosexuality. You can go to jail for it. There's a lot of African countries where there's either a death penalty or a life in prison in some cases. But all the effort was put on, Russia, the bad guys. And a lot of propaganda claiming that the Russian authorities were out there beating people up and stuff like that. And again, it was propaganda. I mean, maybe some skinheads or something. I mean, skinheads beat up people in America, and we don't blame the U.S. government for it. So, if you film some freaking skinhead beating someone up in Moscow and then implying that this is in some way part of the government, most people in America don't even know where Russia is. They're going to be like, yeah, that's bad, and Russia should stop doing that. Well, the thing is that I don't think that's the Russian policy. They're not great. But anyway, that particular issue that was really pushed by Barack Obama, who I might add, until the 2012 election, was very much opposed to gay marriage. Just remember that, very much opposed to gay marriage, and then switched his stand just before the election, and then is criticizing Putin. There's a reason for this. The reason is because Russia irked the United States by letting Edward Snowden come in. And I don't think you'd be having as many news reports and Russian demonization taking place if it had not been for the situation as it occurred with Edward Snowden. Now, on top of this, too, the whole Ukraine thing. It would take too long to go into the relationship between Libya, Syria, and Russia, Ukraine, and so forth. But I will say this. It is quite interesting that just in the last year, everyone was praising Putin for preventing a war taking place over Syria. The popularity polls, even in the United States, showed that Putin was beating Obama when it came to prestige as a world leader. Now, think about that. Is it just coincidental that you could take this issue, these protests and so forth, which they've not proven? In fact, there was a commission recently that said there was no proof that the police under the former president who was thrown out or he fled. It was a coup. He wasn't thrown out by an election, even though Barack Obama got up and stated that it was a duly elected government. No, it wasn't. But the thing is that, and of course Obama knew that. I mean, that's kind of a neuro-linguistic programming thing. You just say it and you realize most people will accept it. The thing is that, what better thing to do from the U.S. perspective or NATO perspective to weaken Russia than to take conflict right to its front door? Now, I'll say this much. If the Chinese were funding groups in Mexico that were hostile to the United States and the business and economic and cultural connections that existed between Mexico and America, how would America be reacting towards the Chinese doing this? I think we already know the answer to that. One of the reasons why the United States went into World War I was because of, and I think it was a forgery, later found to be a forgery, was the Zimmerman Telegraph, in which there was this sudden hysteria that the Germans were trying to get the Mexicans to invade the United States, become allies of Germany, invade the United States. And So we know how America would react. Now, Russia winds up with a situation in which the government that was elected and favorable to them decides, well, the heat's too much, and so they take off, and, the government's overthrown. And then a new government comes in, which is basically, looking to NATO and the United States to give it its foreign policy. And of course, Putin is going to react, and especially when you have a lot of ethnic, cultural Russians in areas that are almost predominantly in the East. Look it up for yourself. Look at the ethnic and religious breakdown of Ukraine. The eastern section, and as well as Crimea, which used to be part of Russia until the 50s, that whole area is overwhelmingly Russian. Now, they want to leave. And the weird part is now the governments of the West are encouraging the government in Kiev to stomp on these so-called insurgents and get rid of them and to use all force necessary. And yet, a few months ago, when the other government that was pro-Russian was preventing the protesters from taking over the government offices or something like that, they were demanding that sanctions be placed on Russia. So, this whole propaganda, if you think that the propaganda that was used to make the Germans, look bad, that the lies that the Germans during World War I were bayoneting pregnant women and raping nuns and burning people alive and all kinds of weird atrocity that later came out that it was British intelligence that had actually fabricated those stories. Think about it today, and remember, this is this year is the 100-year anniversary of World War I. Now, have we gotten any smarter? Are we more perceptive towards when it comes to propaganda and mind control? Well, I don't think so. And I just encourage people to look up, you can take a look at, there's a video just got released by Democracy Now! It's an interview with Glenn Greenwald, in which he talks about the U.S. media in relation to all of this spying and things like that. Just type in Greenwald, Democracy Now!, media obsolete, or neutered. Yeah, that's the word, neutered. And you'll find the video, and you can see how this whole process can take place. And no, I'm not talking about satellites, although I'm not doubting what he said, Dr. Hall. But the thing is, we first have to actually realize where the mind control is coming from old school, the old techniques of propaganda and twisting the truth around in order to fit an agenda. And once we get to that point, I don't think there's any going back. It's just like in the Matrix. Once you take the pill, you can't go back to the way things were because you see through it. Anyway, take care. I encourage you to, share. I'm going to put the video up of Dr. Hall, and you can look that up, interview, Unlock the Door Radio, and share that with friends. And, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I wouldn't mind that either. And also to UCY TV's YouTube channel. Anyway, I'll see you all next week for another very interesting episode of Unlock the Door Radio. Take care.
Today I am joined by researchers who invent some of the most advanced metals on the planet, designers who are modeling prototypes in the digital cloud, folks from the Pentagon who help to support their work. Basically, I'm here to announce that we're building Iron Man.
For more news, visit youtube.com/pigmind5.
This is Ozzy Skateboard.